And at this time, we will have Barbara introduce the speaker.
Okay. Well, I'm really excited after I read about this gentleman, and I can't wait to hear him speak to us today. Our speaker today has 25-year background in analyzing, acquiring, and turning around failing businesses. Successful ventures enabled him to retire at a young age. How many want to retire at a young age? And now he's using those experiences and expertise to analyze and identify wasteful government spending. It's right on time, isn't it? He's a member of the Mid-Alabama Republican Club. He's on the advisory committee of Lawson State Community College. He's a proud supporter of Toys for Tots, and he's going to be one of the featured speakers at the Alabama Federated Republican Women's Legislative Days at the end of the month. Please, let's give a warm welcome to Mr. Lamar Lackey.
Thank you. I wasn't aware of the latter part, so you just informed me of something I didn't know. So I'm a little bit surprised.
Well, pleasantly, I hope. That was in a bulletin that I read, and I went, well, he's not got that down. I hope he knows that.
Well, I had talked to Lois about that and had provided everything to her, but I was not aware that I had made the cut, so to speak.
Well, we better, put her in touch with you, hadn't we?
So I'm extremely proud of that.
I'm flattered, and I hope that's a pleasant surprise.
It is. It is.
I think I've got all that with me later. I'll show it to you.
Well, great. Well, for those of you who aren't familiar with me, I'm really nobody. Okay, so the introduction was true, but it doesn't really go to the heart of who I am, if you will. My background is investment banking, venture capital, concentrated in startups and doing turnarounds for the most part. But prior to doing that, I want to give you a little background about who I am and so forth. I'm married, been married almost 21 years to a Sarah Palin put it, a pit bull with lipstick. My wife is half Lebanese, half Italian, and she's mean, so she just keeps me on the straight and narrow. And so we have a little girl who is almost 8 years old, and she does the same thing when Mama's not around. So I have two bosses. I have the boss's boss and the boss's boss. So, but be all that as it may, they keep me grounded, they keep me centered, and that's what I really need. My background in investment banking and venture capital really started out as nothing more than greed. I enjoyed money, I wanted to make more money, and so that's really how I started to get involved in business, was just a desire for money. Money always motivated me, but I never, ever let it take control of me. In other words, when I had money, when I had cash, I always invested it. So as a result, I never blew it. I've never owned a new car, for example. To this day, my wife, I think, has had 3. I'm still waiting for my first one. But it's that grounding and that always using what I had and trying to better it and to perpetuate it that got me to where I stand today. A couple of years ago, I asked myself a question. I said, what would I do if I had more money? And I couldn't answer the question. We would not get a bigger house. My wife and I are deeply rooted where we are, and no way we're going to move. So that really wasn't an option. Really didn't want a new car. I kind of like the cars I got, so pretty happy. So I couldn't answer the question. And that began me to do a little soul searching, which led me to a conclusion that maybe my time in the capital arena was over. And that I needed to redirect my talents and my experience in another direction. As a result, I became involved in politics. and particularly the county politics, Jefferson County to be specific. I considered the possibility of running for county commission, and I had some very close friends that convinced me not to. The reason they convinced me not to is they said, Lamar, you, quite frankly, are not a people person. You haven't mastered the art of seduction. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? They said, when it comes to catching mice, you're the trap and not the cheese. And the cheese is the seductive part of the equation. So I accepted it for what it was, and needless to say, I began to get involved behind the scenes and began to look at what was wrong and to find more, to find out more about why it was the way it was. And what I discovered, it was a culture. But as a result, that led me down a path, and eventually I started to look beyond the county, and I started to look at what was wrong with the state. And then that led me to ultimately, several weeks ago, Keith has been a part of this, the early stages of the formation of a foundation. And the foundation is the foundation for fiscal, social, physical accountability and responsibility, which at the heart is everything I stand for. Jefferson County and the state of Alabama have a lot in common. Both are facing their own respective tsunamis. And I don't use that word in an exaggerated way. I use that word in arguably a literal way. Jefferson County's problems are its financial problems. And that just sums it up right there. The state, however, has several complex problems. The states are financial, but also the state is in the southeast. The southeast, for those of you that don't know, has just been nicknamed in the last 2 days the diabetes belt, the stroke belt. In addition, the state has what I call voter nepotism. We tend to elevate people from the legislative branch of government to the executive branch. And just because somebody's a good legislator doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be a good executive. Just because you're a good executive doesn't mean you're a good legislator. To further that, I've always used the analogy, just because you can play ball doesn't mean you can coach ball. Just because you can coach ball doesn't mean you can play ball. But that is a problem that exists out there, is that the executive branch of government is the management of our state, for example. The legislative branch, on the other hand, is the board of directors. And then we, the people, are the stockholders. And understanding that, you then start to understand how the pieces work together. The executive branch is responsible for implementation. They implement the policy. They're the stewards, the fiduciaries. And so, as a result, that's my background. That's what I did in business. I rarely have sat on boards, if you will. I've always been in the executive branch side of business, meaning I've typically been in the executive level of management, where policy gets implemented, where rubber and road meet, where the efficiencies, the money flows, and the efficiencies are to be recognized so that profit is created. And profit is something that is needed even in government, because the profit, the savings, are what we use to funnel towards services, for example. I have always felt in business that employees were the biggest asset. I've never been one to come in and say, we got to cut people. Cutting people is always the last thing on my list. And yet, in the county and in the state, that's kind of what everybody wants to do first. It's easy to cut people. So as a result, I'm somewhat of the outsider, if you will. In Jefferson County, the problems that exist in the county from a business standpoint are the lack of centralization, the lack of standardization, Therefore, economies of scale are not recognized, and there is no shared sacrifice. And I'll touch on those and detail those as I go. In addition to the fact, the other problem that the county has is the county attorney's office. And I won't bore you with a lot of the details, but the county attorney's office is the internal legal department of the county. The county has an internal legal department to handle its legal affairs. Plain and simple. That's why they have all these attorneys on payroll, 5 of which. 4 of these 5 attorneys make wages alone more than $250,000 a year. Now let me put this into perspective here. The governor does not, well, if he took a paycheck. If the governor took a paycheck, he would not be making $250,000 a year. Eric Holder, who's the U.S. Attorney General, the nation's top cop, doesn't make $250,000 a year. Luther Strange, who is the Attorney General of the state of Alabama, one of the top paid state attorney generals, does not make $250,000 a year. The lead county attorney makes more than the President of the United States of America. Makes more than $400,000 a year. Now, if the county were getting results, I might could justify that. But let me put something into perspective. This department has spent more than $20 million in the last 3 years, fiscal year 2007 to 2010. This department spent over $21 million in outside legal fees. In the 10-year period prior to that, they spent $6 million. So there is not a cost-benefit argument that can be made. If that's not bad enough, these 5 county attorneys are guaranteed a 5% increase in their wages every year by resolution with no ceiling whatsoever. They are carved outside of outside of the Jefferson County Personnel Board. So they have no ceiling relative to their pay grades. So basically, from a compounding standpoint, every 10 years, their salary doubles, roughly. Albert Einstein said that defined insanity as doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome. And Jefferson County almost epitomizes that right there. The state of Alabama, as I said, has got lots of problems. There's a little more complex. There are 186 agencies, roughly, that comprise the state of Alabama. 186 kingdoms. Their own king, their own little departments, their own oversight, and everything else.